Every 3 minutes, another ship disappears into the narrowest section of the world's busiest waterway. Not every 3 hours, not every 3 days. Every 3 minutes, around the clock, without pause. At its tightest point, this corridor of water is only 2.7 kilometers wide. A modern container ship can be more than 400 meters long. Do the mathematics, and you begin to understand what is happening here. Dozens of enormous vessels are passing through a gap that is barely wider than the ship itself, every single hour, every single day, every single year. Seen from above, the passage does not resemble an empty ocean route. It looks like a moving industrial landscape. Tankers, container ships, bulk carriers, and smaller local vessels advance through the same restricted space, each following a path measured with extraordinary care. There is little room for improvisation. A minor error in speed, direction, or timing can affect not one vessel, but the long chain of ships approaching behind it. This is the Strait of Malacca, and if you have never heard of it, you are almost certainly among the billions of people whose daily lives depend on it without knowing it. More than 102,500 ships transited this waterway in 2025 alone. That is more vessel traffic than any other choke point on Earth, more than the Suez Canal, more than the Panama Canal, more than the Strait of Hormuz. In terms of sheer traffic volume, this narrow passage between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra handles more shipping than any other single stretch of water in the world. The rhythm is continuous rather than spectacular. One vessel clears the channel, another enters, and several more wait beyond the narrowest point. From a distance, the movement can appear slow. In economic terms, it is relentless. Each ship represents contracts, schedules, fuel requirements, factory orders, and delivery promises that extend far beyond the water visible from shore. And yet for China, the world's second-largest economy and its largest importer of oil, this strait is not simply a trade route. It is the most dangerous vulnerability in the entire Chinese strategic picture. A narrow gap that Beijing does not control, cannot easily replace, and has been desperate to find alternatives to for more than 2 decades. A gap that one hostile navy could theoretically close. And a closure that would not simply inconvenience the Chinese economy. It would begin to strangle it. That vulnerability is difficult to see from the deck of an ordinary ship. The water still appears open. The horizon still stretches far beyond the channel. But strategic dependence is not measured by how wide the sea looks. It is measured by how many essential supplies have no practical route around it. For China, the danger lies in that hidden calculation. The traffic looks routine, while the consequences of interruption would be anything but routine. To understand why, you first have to understand what flows through the Strait of Malacca. The strait stretches roughly 900 kilometers in a northwest to southeast direction, running between mainland Southeast Asia to the north and the island of Sumatra to the south. It is wide enough in its northern reaches, spanning up to 250 kilometers across. But it narrows progressively as it moves towards Singapore, compressing into a funnel that becomes more and more congested the further south you travel. At the southern end lies the Phillips Channel, the section of the Singapore Strait that forms the true bottleneck. Here, the navigable water is barely 2.7 kilometers wide. The depth in places is only 25 meters, shallow enough to restrict the largest tankers when fully loaded. And yet, through this compressed corridor, approximately 23.2 million barrels of oil and petroleum products flowed every single day in the first half of 2025. That figure represents roughly 29% of all seaborne oil trade on the planet. It exceeds the volume flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. In terms of oil volume alone, the Strait of Malacca is the world's largest maritime energy choke point. The narrowing happens gradually, which makes the scale of the compression easy to underestimate. Ships entering from the northwest may spend hours moving through broad water before the route begins to tighten around them. Traffic grows denser. Turning options become fewer. The open sea becomes an organized corridor, and the corridor eventually becomes a single controlled passage near Singapore. By the time vessels reach the southern end, geography has already decided where they must go. The total value of cargo transiting the strait annually has been estimated at approximately 3.4 trillion US dollars. That is not the GDP of a small country. That is roughly equivalent to the entire economic output of Germany, the world's third largest economy, passing through a gap narrower than many harbor entrances every single year. The value is not concentrated in a single kind of cargo. It is spread across energy, raw materials, manufactured goods, and components moving between factories that may be separated by entire oceans. A delay in the strait can therefore travel through several industries at once. One shipment may affect fuel markets, another may delay production, another may leave retailers waiting for goods already promised to customers. The channel carries separate cargoes, but the economic consequences are connected. Ships carry crude oil from the Persian Gulf to refineries in China, Japan, and South Korea. They carry liquefied natural gas from Qatar and Australia to power stations across East Asia. They carry iron ore from Australia and Brazil to Chinese steel mills. They carry electronics, automobiles, chemicals, and consumer goods in both directions, connecting the factories of Asia to the markets of Europe and the Middle East. The strait is not merely an energy corridor, it is the central artery of the entire global trading system in the Asia-Pacific region. Japan is among the most exposed nations after China. More than 80% of Japan's oil imports transit the Strait of Malacca, according to the Nippon Foundation. Japan has almost no domestic oil production and runs its entire industrial economy on imported energy. South Korea is in a nearly identical position, with the overwhelming majority of its oil and LNG supplies arriving by tanker through the same narrow corridor. Taiwan, which sits at the eastern end of the South China Sea, through which ships emerging from the strait must continue to travel, faces a compounded vulnerability. The strait is the first choke point. The waters around Taiwan are the second. Any disruption to either affects all three economies simultaneously. The scale of daily dependence is almost impossible to absorb. Every hour, approximately 10 to 11 ships transit the narrowest section of the strait. Every one of those ships is carrying cargo that someone, somewhere, is expecting to receive. The iron ore will feed a blast furnace. The crude oil will be refined into diesel that will fill trucks, ships, and generators. The LNG will generate electricity that will power factories, hospitals, and apartment buildings. The container cargo will restock store shelves that were emptied by consumers who had no idea that what they bought had passed through a waterway 2.7 kilometers wide. The connection between the cargo and daily life is rarely visible. Oil arrives as movement. Gas arrives as light and heat. Iron ore arrives as buildings, machines, and vehicles. Containers arrive as thousands of ordinary objects placed on shelves, delivered to factories, or carried to homes. The Strait of Malacca sits near the beginning of these chains, far from the people who experience their final result. That distance allows the waterway to remain almost invisible, even while it supports routines across an entire region. The story of this waterway is as old as maritime trade itself. For centuries before anyone in Europe had contemplated sailing to Asia, the Strait of Malacca was already one of the most commercially important passages in the world. The geography made it almost inevitable. Any ship sailing between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, between the civilizations of India and the Middle East on one side, and the civilizations of China and Japan on the other, had a choice of three routes. They could sail north of Sumatra and brave the storms of the Bay of Bengal and the open ocean. They could attempt the much longer southern passage around the bottom of the Indonesian archipelago. Or they could thread through the Strait of Malacca, sheltered from the worst ocean weather, with opportunities to take on fresh water and provisions along the way. Geography chose for them. The strait became the highway. Long before engines, radar, and satellite navigation, sailors were already responding to the same shape of land and water. Their ships were smaller and their journeys slower, but the decision was familiar. Follow the protected route between the coasts, or accept the greater distance and danger of the open sea. Generations of merchants made the same calculation. Over time, Repeated journeys transformed the passage from a natural channel into a commercial system linking distant civilizations. The first great maritime power to recognize and exploit this geography was Srivijaya, a Buddhist empire centered in what is now Palembang in southern Sumatra. From the 7th century onward, Srivijaya used its naval power to control both shores of the strait, suppressing piracy and imposing order on commercial traffic while collecting tribute from vessels passing through. The empire grew enormously wealthy on this arrangement and maintained dominance over the waterway for more than 5 centuries. After Srivijaya fragmented in the 13th century, the strategic vacuum was filled by a new power. In the early 15th century, a Malay ruler transformed a small fishing settlement near the southern end of the strait into one of the greatest commercial entrepôts the world had ever seen. At the height of its power, the Sultanate of Malacca was a place where traders from Arabia, Persia, India, China, Java, Siam, and dozens of other cultures gathered to exchange goods. A Portuguese apothecary who lived there in the early 16th century reported that as many as 84 different languages were spoken within the city. No other port in the world at that time could match it for the sheer diversity of merchants and goods passing through its harbor. A port at this location did more than receive ships. It allowed merchants to wait for favorable conditions, exchange cargo, repair vessels, and meet traders arriving from entirely different parts of the world. Goods could change hands several times before continuing their journey. So could languages, beliefs, technologies, and customs. Malacca became powerful not because it produced everything people wanted, but because it stood at the point where almost everything had to pass. The secret, as always, was geography. Control Malacca, and you controlled the flow of spices from the Moluccas eastward and the flow of Chinese silk and porcelain westward. It was the most valuable commercial position in Asia, and everyone knew it. In 1511, Portuguese forces under Afonso de Albuquerque captured the city after a brutal siege. The Portuguese did not come because Malacca was beautiful or because its people were formidable enemies. They came because they understood, with complete strategic clarity, that whoever held Malacca held the keys to the spice trade between Asia and Europe. As Albuquerque himself wrote, if the Portuguese could take Malacca from Muslim merchants, they would strike a blow at the commercial heart of the Islamic world and transfer its wealth to Lisbon. The Portuguese were followed by the Dutch, who seized Malacca in 1641 and shifted the center of their operations further south to Batavia, the city that is now Jakarta. The British eventually arrived and established a new port at Penang in 1786, later adding Singapore in 1819. For 5 centuries, the great colonial powers of Europe competed for control of this waterway because they understood something that is just as true today as it was in the age of sail. The power that controls the Strait of Malacca has leverage over every economy that depends on what flows through it. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that leverage belonged to Britain. Today, the question of who controls this strait is considerably more complicated. This history left the strait with a political character that no single modern state can completely define. The coastline belongs to several countries. The shipping belongs to the world. The cargo may begin in one region, be owned by a company in another, carried by a crew from several nations, and delivered to a port thousands of kilometers away. Control is therefore divided, responsibility is shared, and any disruption immediately becomes an international problem. The 3 countries whose shores define the strait are Malaysia to the north, Singapore at the southern end, and Indonesia to the south. All 3 are members of ASEAN, and all 3 have formal cooperative arrangements for managing maritime security in the waterway, including coordinated naval patrols established in 2004 and regular information sharing through maritime surveillance systems. In peacetime, the strait functions remarkably smoothly. Modern traffic separation schemes keep thousands of vessels moving without collision. Piracy, which was a serious problem in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when attacks in some years exceeded 250 incidents, has been dramatically reduced through coordinated enforcement. By 2017, Malaysian authorities were reporting 0 piracy incidents in their section of the waterway. But no one imagines that peacetime is the only scenario worth planning for. The history of piracy in the strait is long, sometimes brutal, and far from entirely resolved. In the peak years of the early 2000s, the International Maritime Bureau recorded more than 150 attacks annually in the waters of the Strait of Malacca and Singapore Strait combined. Ships were boarded at night by gangs armed with machetes and firearms. Crews were robbed, sometimes assaulted, occasionally killed. Cargo was stolen. In the most serious incidents, entire ships were hijacked and their identities falsified so that the vessel could be used to carry illegal goods or sold to criminal operators across the region. The insurance market responded by classifying the strait as a high-risk zone, adding costs to every voyage. The response was a landmark example of regional cooperation. In 2004, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore launched coordinated naval patrols known as the Malacca Strait Patrols, supplemented by combined air patrols and an information-sharing network. Thailand joined in 2008. The results were dramatic. Attacks fell sharply, and by the mid-2010s, some stretches of the strait went years without a single reported incident. By 2017, Malaysian authorities were reporting 0 piracy incidents in their section of the waterway. American naval planners have studied the Strait of Malacca for decades, not because they intend to close it, but because they understand the leverage it would create. In any serious military confrontation with China, the ability to interdict shipping through the strait would be extraordinary. That success also reveals how delicate the system can be. Safe passage depends on coordination that most travelers and consumers never see. Patrol vessels must communicate, authorities must exchange information, commercial crews must follow traffic rules, report suspicious activity, and maintain watch through crowded waters. When each part works, the strait appears calm. When even one part fails, the same geography that concentrates legitimate trade can also concentrate danger. Beijing understands this perfectly, and it terrifies them. In 2003, the then president of China, Hu Jintao, addressed the Communist Party's Central Committee and used a phrase that has since become central to Chinese strategic discourse. He spoke of what he called the Malacca Dilemma, the dangerous dependence of the Chinese economy on a single narrow waterway that China does not control and that a hostile power could potentially close. The phrase captured something that Chinese strategists had understood for years but had not previously articulated so plainly in public. The mathematics of the dilemma are stark. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil, consuming more than 15 million barrels per day by 2025, of which approximately 11 million barrels were imported. Roughly 80% of those imports, representing around 8 to 9 million barrels per day, passed through the Strait of Malacca. In addition, approximately 2/3 of China's total seaborne trade, covering everything from iron ore and coal to consumer electronics and manufactured goods, moves through the same waterway. The total annual value of Chinese cargo transiting the strait has been estimated at more than $2 trillion. No other major economy in the world is as dependent on a single maritime chokepoint that it does not control. Not the United States, not the European Union, not Japan, which is also heavily dependent on Malacca, but has a different strategic relationship with the powers that could threaten it. China's exposure is uniquely severe, uniquely visible, and uniquely difficult to solve. The dependence is especially striking because it has accumulated gradually. Every new refinery supplied through the route, every factory built around imported materials, and every port connected to these shipping patterns deepens the existing system. Once that system becomes large enough, replacing it is no longer a matter of choosing another line on a map. Roads, pipelines, terminals, contracts, fleets, and industrial schedules have all been organized around the same passage. Geography becomes embedded in the economy. The reason it is so difficult to solve comes down, once again, to geography. The alternatives to the Strait of Malacca are not simply less convenient. They are genuinely inadequate substitutes for a problem of this scale. The Sunda Strait, which separates the Indonesian islands of Java and Sumatra, is shallower and too narrow for the largest vessels. The Lombok Strait, further east between the islands of Bali and Lombok, is navigable, but it adds roughly 1,000 to 1,500 nautical miles to a voyage. That means 3 to 5 extra days at sea, along with significantly higher fuel costs. An estimate from Singapore's RSIS Research Institute has suggested that rerouting Chinese trade through Lombok and the Makassar Strait could add costs of between $84 and $220 billion annually. That is not an inconvenience. That is an economic shock. A detour also changes more than distance. It changes arrival times, fuel consumption, vessel availability, freight prices, and the number of ships required to move the same volume of cargo. A few additional days at sea may sound manageable when considering one vessel. Applied to thousands of voyages, however, those days become a major burden. The alternative routes exist on maps, but none can reproduce the speed, capacity, and established infrastructure of Malacca at the same cost. China has pursued land-based alternatives with enormous investment and determination. The China-Myanmar Economic Corridor includes oil and gas pipelines running from the port of Kyaukphyu on the Bay of Bengal through Myanmar's territory into Yunnan province in southwestern China. When operational, these pipelines bypass the Strait of Malacca entirely, but their capacity is only around 440,000 barrels per day, roughly 4% of China's daily oil import volume. The Myanmar civil war, following the 2021 military coup, has severely disrupted operations and investment confidence. A bypass carrying 4% of the required volume through a country in the grip of civil war is not a solution. It is a thin thread. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, connecting the deep water port of Gwadar on Pakistan's Arabian Sea coast to Xinjiang in northwestern China through roads, railways, and pipelines, represents a more ambitious attempt at strategic diversification. But the overland distance is enormous. The terrain is among the most challenging in the world, and the security situation in Balochistan, where Gwadar is located, remains difficult. The corridor exists and carries some energy and goods, but not at anything approaching the scale needed to meaningfully reduce Malacca dependency. Perhaps the most ambitious proposal is the Kra Canal. The project has been discussed since the 17th century. At that time, the Thai king Narai commissioned French engineers to assess the possibility of cutting through the narrow Kra Isthmus in southern Thailand, connecting the Gulf of Thailand to the Andaman Sea. A Kra Canal would allow ships to bypass the Strait of Malacca entirely, saving roughly 1,200 nautical miles and 2 to 3 days of transit time. China has lobbied extensively for this project because a canal through Thai territory, potentially financed and built with Chinese participation, could provide a genuine strategic alternative to Malacca. As of 2025, Thailand has opted instead to prioritize a land bridge project using rail connections across the isthmus, a significantly less impactful alternative for maritime trade. The canal itself remains unbuilt, as it has for more than 300 years. The persistence of the canal proposal shows how difficult the dilemma has become. The potential reward is obvious: a route that avoids the narrow southern passage and shortens the journey between two seas. But the scale of such a project is equally obvious. It would reshape transport patterns, require vast construction, and alter the strategic importance of ports that currently depend on Malacca. For centuries, the idea has remained suspended between geographical logic and political reality. The strategic reality is almost identical to what Hu Jintao identified in 2003. 2 decades and enormous investments later, approximately 80% of China's oil imports still flow through a waterway that China does not control and that a hostile power could theoretically close. In a Taiwan conflict scenario, or any serious military confrontation between the United States and China, the Strait of Malacca immediately becomes a critical pressure point. American naval planners would not need to physically blockade the strait in the dramatic sense of stationing warships across the shipping lanes. The threat of disruption, combined with the withdrawal of insurance coverage for vessels in a declared conflict zone, would be enough to halt commercial shipping. The same dynamic that applied to the Strait of Hormuz in 2026 would apply here. Markets move faster than militaries. The commercial calculation shifts before the first shot is fired. Chinese strategists have long contemplated this scenario. They have concluded that in the event of a Taiwan conflict, China's strategic petroleum reserves, currently estimated at around 90 days of consumption, would provide a critical buffer. But a blockade lasting longer than that buffer would begin to inflict serious damage on the Chinese economy, affecting not only transportation fuel, but also petrochemical feedstocks, plastics production, agricultural inputs, and electricity generation. The downstream effects of a sustained energy shortage would cascade through every sector of an economy as integrated and complex as China's. 90 days may appear to offer time. In a crisis, however, reserves are not a permanent replacement for normal supply. They are a countdown. Each day of disruption reduces the margin available to governments and industries, while uncertainty changes prices before physical shortages become severe. Companies begin protecting inventories. Buyers compete for alternative cargoes. Transportation costs rise. The longer the route remains threatened, the more decisions are shaped by fear of what may happen next, rather than by what has already happened. This is the lever. This is why the Strait of Malacca matters in ways that go far beyond shipping statistics and cargo values. The lever works in both directions. China's vulnerability is also a constraint on Chinese behavior. A Beijing that cannot guarantee its own energy supply through a waterway it does not control must be more cautious in any confrontation that could provoke the United States into interdicting that supply. The Malacca Dilemma is not only a military problem, it is a political one. It shapes Chinese foreign policy, Chinese military investment, and Chinese diplomatic calculations every single day, even when no crisis is imminent and no ships are being stopped. This produces a form of pressure that exists even during peaceful years. No blockade has to be announced for decision makers to remember that it is possible. No vessel has to be stopped for investors, military planners, and government officials to calculate the risk. The possibility becomes part of every larger choice involving Taiwan, the South China Sea, naval expansion, energy reserves, and overseas infrastructure. The strait influences strategy precisely because it does not need to close in order to matter. Consider the city of Singapore, which sits at the southern end of the strait like a fulcrum on which the entire regional trading system balances. Singapore has almost no natural resources. It has a population of fewer than 6 million people on an island of 733 square kilometers, and yet it is consistently ranked among the world's most important financial centers, home to the world's second busiest container port and a critical refining and transshipment hub for the entire Asian energy trade. Singapore exists because of the strait. Its wealth, its regional influence, and its extraordinary prosperity are entirely functions of its position at the southern bottleneck of the world's most trafficked shipping corridor. In a very real sense, Singapore is what Malacca was 5 centuries ago, a city whose power derives entirely from its ability to serve and profit from the flow of trade through a geographic chokepoint. From Singapore's shoreline, the importance of location is visible in constant motion. Ships gather beyond the port, waiting, refueling, transferring cargo, or preparing for the next stage of their voyage. The city does not merely sit beside international trade. It has organized much of its modern identity around serving that trade efficiently. The strait brings movement past its coast, and Singapore converts that movement into services, connections, influence, and wealth. The fishermen who work the waters between Malaysia and Indonesia have no reason to think about any of this. They set their nets in the early morning, before the heat builds over the low-lying islands and the water turns from dark blue to turquoise. They navigate among ships that carry more cargo in a single voyage than their entire village will consume in a lifetime. Those ships pass so close in the narrow southern sections of the strait that the fishermen can sometimes read the names painted on their hulls. The tankers and container vessels are simply part of the seascape, as ordinary as clouds. But when analysts in Washington and Beijing look at the same stretch of water, they see something entirely different. They see a pressure point on which the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific rests. They see a vulnerability that no amount of Belt and Road investment, no pipeline through Myanmar, no land bridge across Thailand, has yet been able to eliminate. They see a waterway so essential to the global economy that even threatening to close it changes the behavior of governments, markets, and military planners across the entire world. Both views are true at the same time. For local communities, the strait is a working environment shaped by tides, weather, fishing grounds, and familiar routes. For distant governments, it is a strategic diagram filled with shipping volumes, naval ranges, energy reserves, and possible blockades. The same water carries ordinary livelihoods and extraordinary geopolitical weight. That contrast is one reason the Strait of Malacca is so difficult to understand from statistics alone. The Strait of Malacca is 2.7 kilometers wide. At its narrowest point, through that gap flows 29% of all seaborne oil on the planet. Through that gap flows 2/3 of China's seaborne trade. Through that gap, every 3 minutes, another ship disappears and another begins. Whoever can close that gap holds leverage over the second largest economy on Earth. And the second largest economy on Earth has spent 20 years trying to find a way to change that fact. It has not succeeded yet. Somewhere in the waters south of Singapore right now, a tanker is approaching the Phillips Channel. Its captain has reduced speed. The pilot has come aboard, and the navigation team is alert to the traffic moving in both directions through the separation scheme. The ship will take less than an hour to clear the narrowest section. In that hour, an amount of crude oil sufficient to fuel a large city for several days moves through a corridor barely wider than a runway.